The cold metal of the shackles bit into Lieutenant Jessica Martinez's wrists as she sat perfectly still in the wooden chair. The sound of chains clinking together echoed through the silent military courtroom every time she moved even slightly. Around her, dozens of eyes stared with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and disbelief. How did one of the Navy's most decorated female snipers end up here, facing charges that could destroy everything she had worked for? Jessica kept her back straight and her eyes focused ahead, just like she had been trained to do during her years. As a Navy SEAL, her face showed no emotion, but inside her mind was racing. 6 months ago, she was leading dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Today, she was being treated like a common criminal. The irony wasn't lost on her. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man in his 50s, stood up and began painting a picture that made Jessica sound like a rogue soldier who had lost control. According to him, she had disobeyed direct orders during a classified mission in Eastern Europe. He claimed she had put her entire team at risk because she couldn't control her emotions. The words stung, but Jessica had heard worse things said about her throughout her military career. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," the prosecutor began, his voice carrying across the room like a weapon. "We are here today because Lieutenant Martinez chose to put her personal feelings above military discipline. She chose to ignore the chain of command that keeps our forces safe and effective." Jessica's defense lawyer, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, sat beside her taking notes. Captain Rodriguez was one of the few people who believed in Jessica's innocence, but even she seemed overwhelmed by the evidence stacked against them. Most of the mission details were classified, which meant they couldn't access the information. They needed to prove what really happened. The prosecution's first witness was Colonel David Webb, Jessica's former commanding officer. He walked to the stand with the confidence of a man who had never doubted himself. His uniform was perfect, his posture military straight, and his voice steady as he raised his right hand to swear his oath. Colonel Webb's testimony was damaging. He described Jessica as a soldier who had started showing signs of emotional instability during their deployment. He claimed she had become too attached to their mission objectives and had lost the ability to think clearly under pressure. "Lieutenant Martinez was an excellent soldier for many years," Webb said, looking directly at the jury. "But something changed during our last deployment. She became obsessed with protecting civilian targets, even when it meant putting our own people in danger." The mission in question had taken place 6 months earlier in a small Eastern European country torn apart by civil war. Jessica's team had been sent to extract a high-value target who had been providing intelligence to Allied forces. According to the official report, Jessica had gone off-script during the extraction, engaging enemy forces without permission and causing significant damage to surrounding buildings. The prosecutor showed photographs of the destruction. Buildings with holes blown through their walls, streets covered in debris, and reports of civilian casualties. He made it sound like Jessica had turned a simple extraction mission into a war zone, but Jessica knew the truth was much more complicated than what these photographs showed. She remembered every detail of that night: the sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the faces of innocent people caught in the crossfire. She had made split-second decisions that saved lives, but now those same decisions were being used to destroy her career. The most damaging part of Webb's testimony came when he described Jessica's relationship with the extraction target. Elena Volkov was a young woman who had been risking her life to provide intelligence about enemy movements. According to Webb, Jessica had developed an inappropriate emotional attachment to Elena, which clouded her judgment during the mission. "Lieutenant Martinez seemed to take Elena's situation personally," Webb explained to the court. "When we learned that Elena was being held in conditions that were difficult, Martinez became determined to save her at any cost." Jessica's jaw tightened as she listened to Webb's version of events. He made it sound like she had thrown military protocol out the window because she couldn't handle seeing someone suffer. But the reality was that Elena had been much more than just an intelligence source. She was a trained operative whose cover had been blown, and her capture would have compromised an entire network of agents. The prosecution then called several members of Jessica's team to testify. These were men and women who had served alongside her for years, people she had trusted with her life. But as they took the stand one by one, their testimonies felt rehearsed and cold. Sergeant Mike Torres, who had been Jessica's spotter on dozens of missions, gave testimony that directly contradicted things he had said about her in the past. He described her as unpredictable and emotionally driven, words that Jessica had never heard him use before. "Did Lieutenant Martinez follow proper protocol during the extraction?" the prosecutor asked. "No, sir," Torres replied, not meeting Jessica's eyes. "She deviated from the planned route and engaged targets without authorization." Jessica's defense attorney tried to challenge these testimonies, but without access to classified mission reports and communication logs, she was fighting with one hand tied behind her back. Every piece of evidence that might have supported Jessica's version of events was locked away behind walls of national security classifications. The most frustrating part was that key pieces of evidence had mysteriously disappeared. Security camera footage from the compound where the extraction took place was nowhere to be found. Communication logs from that night had been deleted from the official record. Even GPS tracking data from the team's equipment had vanished. Captain Rodriguez pointed out these missing pieces during her cross-examination, but the prosecution claimed they were either lost due to technical failures or had been destroyed for security reasons. Each missing piece of evidence seemed to make Jessica look more guilty, as if the very system she had sworn to serve was now working against her. As the first day of testimony came to an end, Jessica felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She was facing charges of insubordination, destruction of government property, and assault on a superior officer. If convicted, she would not only lose her career, but could face years in military prison. The media had gotten hold of the story, and headlines were already painting her as a female soldier who couldn't handle the pressure of elite military service. Some articles suggested that women didn't belong in special forces units because they were too emotional to make tough decisions. These stories hurt almost as much as the legal charges. That evening, locked in her temporary holding cell, Jessica stared at the concrete walls and thought about her journey to this moment. She had fought harder than most men to earn her place in the Navy SEALs. She had proven herself in combat situations that would have broken lesser soldiers. She had saved lives, completed impossible missions, and earned the respect of her peers through blood, sweat, and determination. Now all of that was being torn apart by people who hadn't been there, who didn't understand what really happened that night in Eastern Europe. The truth was buried under layers of classification and bureaucracy, and Jessica was beginning to wonder if justice would ever prevail, but she wasn't ready to give up. Somewhere out there was evidence that would prove her innocence. Someone knew the real story of what happened during that extraction mission, and Jessica was determined to fight until that truth came to light, no matter how long it took or what it cost her. The second day of the trial brought even more damaging testimony against Jessica Martinez. As she sat in that same uncomfortable chair, still wearing those cold metal shackles, she could feel the weight of everyone's stares pressing down on her. The courtroom was packed with reporters, military personnel, and curious onlookers who had come to see the downfall of one of the Navy's most celebrated female snipers. Colonel Webb returned to the witness stand, this time with a thick folder of documents and what appeared to be mission briefings. His testimony became more detailed and more damaging as he painted a picture of a soldier who had completely lost control during a critical operation. "The mission was straightforward," Webb explained to the jury, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been in command for decades. "We were to extract Elena Volkov from a compound in the mountains of Eastern Europe. She had been providing valuable intelligence about enemy troop movements, and we had received word that her cover was about to be blown." The prosecutor nodded and gestured for Webb to continue. "What was Lieutenant Martinez's specific role in this operation?" "She was our primary sniper, positioned to provide overwatch and eliminate any threats that might prevent the extraction team from reaching the target," Webb replied. "Her job was to follow orders and maintain her position unless specifically instructed otherwise." But according to Webb's testimony, that's not what happened. He claimed that Jessica had abandoned her assigned position after receiving intelligence that Elena was being held in harsh conditions. Instead of sticking to the plan, she had decided to take matters into her own hands. Lieutenant Martinez became emotionally compromised when she learned about the conditions Elena was facing, Webb continued. The target was being interrogated by enemy forces, and Martinez seemed to take this personally. She began requesting permission to move closer to the compound to change the extraction route, to do things that weren't part of our carefully planned operation. The prosecutor then showed the jury aerial photographs of the compound where the extraction had taken place. It was a concrete building surrounded by high walls located in a valley between two mountains. The photos showed extensive damage to the building and surrounding structures. Can you describe what happened when Lieutenant Martinez deviated from the plan? The prosecutor asked. Webb's face grew serious as he recounted the events. Instead of maintaining her overwatch position, Martinez moved to a location that put her in direct line of fire from enemy positions. When the extraction team encountered resistance, she began engaging targets without waiting for authorization. Her actions turned what should have been a quiet extraction into a full-scale firefight. The damage was significant. According to the official reports, several buildings in the area had been destroyed, and there were reports of civilian casualties. The prosecution showed photographs of the aftermath: broken windows, collapsed walls, and debris scattered across the streets. Jessica watched these images being displayed to the jury, and her heart sank. She knew how bad this looked. The photographs told only part of the story, but they were powerful evidence of destruction and chaos. What the jury couldn't see was the context, the enemy forces that had been closing in, the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire, and the split-second decisions that had to be made to save lives. The most damaging part of Webb's testimony came when he described Jessica's relationship with Elena Volkov. He suggested that Jessica had developed an inappropriate emotional attachment to the woman they were sent to extract. Elena Volkov was young, about the same age as Lieutenant Martinez, Webb explained. She had been working as an intelligence asset for several months, providing information about enemy movements and positions. When Martinez learned about the conditions Elena was facing, the interrogation techniques being used, the physical and psychological pressure, she seemed to lose her objectivity. Webb described how Jessica had repeatedly asked for updates on Elena's condition and had pushed for the extraction timeline to be moved up. He made it sound like Jessica had been more concerned about saving one person than completing the mission successfully. Did Lieutenant Martinez express any personal feelings about the target? The prosecutor asked. She said that Elena reminded her of her younger sister, Webb replied. She talked about how Elena had been brave to risk her life for Allied intelligence, and how we couldn't let her down. It became clear that this was no longer just a mission for Martinez. It had become personal. The prosecution then called other members of Jessica's team to testify about what they had witnessed during the mission. One by one, soldiers who had served alongside Jessica for years took the stand and gave testimony that contradicted everything she thought they believed about her. Sergeant Mike Torres, who had been Jessica's spotter on countless missions, described her actions during the extraction as reckless and dangerous. Lieutenant Martinez seemed different that night, he testified. She was more aggressive than usual, more willing to take risks that put the team in danger. When Captain Rodriguez cross-examined Torres, she tried to get him to admit that Jessica's actions had actually saved lives during the mission. But Torres stuck to his story, claiming that Jessica had made the situation worse by deviating from the plan. Sergeant Torres, Captain Rodriguez said, in your previous debriefings, didn't you state that Lieutenant Martinez's quick thinking prevented casualties among your team? Torres shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I may have said something like that immediately after the mission, but after reviewing the events more carefully, I realized that her actions actually increased the danger we faced. Jessica felt like she was watching strangers testify about someone she didn't recognize. These men and women had been her teammates, her friends, people she had trusted with her life. Now they were describing her as an unstable, emotional soldier who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. Staff Sergeant Amy Chun, who had been part of the extraction team, testified that Jessica had seemed obsessed with Elena's safety to the point where she lost sight of the bigger picture. She kept asking about Elena's condition, wanting to know if she was hurt, if she was being mistreated, Chun said. It was like she forgot that we were all in danger, not just the target. The prosecutor used this testimony to build a narrative that Jessica had become emotionally compromised and had put her personal feelings above military discipline. He suggested that this was exactly the kind of behavior that happened when women were placed in high-stress combat situations, but Captain Rodriguez noticed something strange about all these testimonies. They all sounded very similar, almost like the witnesses had been coached on what to say. The language they used was almost identical, and they all emphasized the same points about Jessica being emotional and unpredictable. During her cross-examinations, Captain Rodriguez tried to point out these inconsistencies, but the prosecution objected to most of her questions. They claimed that detailed questions about the mission could compromise ongoing operations or reveal classified information. The most frustrating part for Jessica's defense was that all the key evidence from the mission remained classified or had mysteriously disappeared. The security footage from the compound that night was gone. The communication logs between team members had been deleted. Even the after-action reports that had been filed immediately following the mission had been replaced with different versions. That painted Jessica in a much more negative light. Captain Rodriguez stood up during one of her cross-examinations and addressed the court directly. Your Honor, we have testimony from multiple witnesses, but we're missing the fundamental evidence that would allow us to verify these accounts. Where are the recordings of radio communications from that night? Where is the security footage that would show us exactly what happened? Where are the original mission reports that were filed immediately after the operation? The prosecutor objected, claiming that this evidence was either classified or had been lost due to technical failures. But the pattern was becoming clear. Every piece of evidence that might have supported Jessica's version of events had conveniently disappeared. As the second day of testimony concluded, Jessica felt the walls closing in around her. The prosecution had painted a picture of a female soldier who had cracked under pressure, who had let her emotions override her training and judgment. The testimony from her own teammates had been devastating, even though something about it felt wrong. That night, back in her cell, Jessica replayed the events of that mission in her mind for the 100th time. She remembered the sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the fear in Elena's eyes when they finally reached her. She remembered making decisions in seconds that these people were now analyzing for months. She remembered saving lives, not destroying them, but in this courtroom the truth seemed to matter less than the story being told. And right now, that story was destroying everything Jessica had worked for her entire adult life. Captain Lisa Rodriguez knew something wasn't right. She had been practicing military law for 15 years, and she had never seen a case where so much evidence had simply vanished. As she sat in her small office late into the night, surrounded by boxes of documents and legal briefs, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica Martinez was being set up. The testimonies from Jessica's teammates bothered her the most. These were soldiers who had served together for years, who had been through life-and-death situations as a team. Yet when they testified against Jessica, their words sounded cold and rehearsed. It was as if they were reading from a script rather than sharing their actual memories of what happened. Rodriguez had requested copies of all the original mission reports, communication logs, and security footage from the night of the extraction. Every single request had been denied or met with claims that the evidence no longer existed. In her experience, the military kept detailed records of everything, especially classified operations. For so much evidence to disappear at once was practically impossible. While she was struggling with the official channels, Rodriguez received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was disguised, clearly altered by some kind of electronic device, but the information they provided was too detailed to ignore. "Captain Rodriguez," the voice said, "if you want to save Lieutenant Martinez, you need to look deeper into Colonel Webb's background. Check his financial records from the past 2 years. Look at his gambling habits and ask yourself why Elena Volkov was really so important. The call ended before Rodriguez could ask any questions. But the mysterious caller had given her something to work with. She spent the next several days quietly investigating Webb's background, using her contacts in the military intelligence community to dig up information that wasn't readily available. What she found was disturbing. Colonel Webb had significant gambling debts that had been piling up for over 2 years. He had been making frequent trips to casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas, often losing thousands of dollars in a single night. His bank records showed several large deposits that couldn't be explained by his military salary. Even more interesting was what Rodriguez discovered about Elena Volkov. The official reports described her as a local intelligence asset who had been providing information about enemy troop movements. But when Rodriguez dug deeper, she found hints that Elena was much more than that. Through her contacts in the intelligence community, Rodriguez learned that Elena had been a trained CIA operative working undercover. She wasn't just some local woman who had decided to help Allied forces. She was a professional spy whose cover had been blown by someone with access to classified information. This revelation changed everything. If Elena was a CIA operative, then her extraction wasn't just about saving one intelligence source. It was about protecting an entire network of spies and operations that could have been compromised if Elena had been captured and interrogated. Rodriguez realized that Jessica's actions during the mission might not have been emotional outbursts at all. They might have been desperate attempts to prevent an intelligence disaster that could have cost countless lives and compromised ongoing operations around the world. Armed with this new information, Rodriguez prepared for the next phase of the trial. But she knew she had to be careful. Someone with significant power and influence was working very hard to make Jessica look guilty, and Rodriguez suspected that challenging the official narrative might put her own career at risk. Meanwhile, the trial continued, and it was Jessica's turn to take the stand in her own defense. As she walked to the witness chair, still wearing those metal shackles that had become a symbol of her fall from grace, every eye in the courtroom followed her movement. Jessica raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, knowing that her words might be the only thing standing between her and a lifetime in military prison. Captain Rodriguez had coached her on what to say and what not to say, but Jessica also knew that there were limits to how much of the truth she could reveal without compromising ongoing operations. "Lieutenant Martinez," Rodriguez began, "can you tell the court about your military service record?" Jessica's voice was steady and strong as she described her journey from a young recruit to one of the Navy's most elite snipers. She talked about the years of training, the physical and mental challenges she had overcome, and the numerous successful missions she had completed without incident. "I joined the Navy because I wanted to serve my country," Jessica said, looking directly at the jury. "I became a SEAL because I wanted to be part of the best fighting force in the world. Every mission I've ever been on, every decision I've ever made in combat, has been guided by my oath to protect and defend the United States and its allies." When Rodriguez asked about the night of the extraction, Jessica's testimony was careful, but powerful. She couldn't reveal classified details about Elena's true identity or the broader intelligence implications of the mission, but she could describe her thought process and the split-second decisions she had been forced to make. "When we arrived at the compound that night, the situation was already more dangerous than we had expected," Jessica explained. "Enemy forces had moved into positions that weren't shown in our intelligence briefings. The extraction route we had planned was compromised, and it became clear that we were walking into a trap." Jessica described how she had to make rapid decisions to adapt to changing conditions on the ground. She had moved from her original position not because she was emotional or reckless, but because the tactical situation required her to provide cover for her teammates from a different angle. "Every shot I fired that night was to protect my team and ensure the success of our mission," Jessica said firmly. "I followed my training and my instincts, and I made decisions based on the information available to me at that moment. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint Jessica as an emotional soldier who had cracked under pressure, who had let her personal feelings override her military training. He brought up her comments about Elena, reminding her of her sister, suggesting that this emotional connection had clouded her judgment, but Jessica held her ground. Elena Volkov was an asset who had risked her life to provide intelligence that saved American lives, she said. My job was to extract her safely, and that's exactly what I did. If caring about the safety of someone who had served our country makes me emotional, then I'm proud to be emotional. The prosecutor pressed harder, trying to get Jessica to admit that she had disobeyed orders or acted recklessly. But every question was met with calm, measured responses that emphasized her commitment to the mission and her team. During a break in testimony, Rodriguez noticed something that made her blood run cold. Colonel Webb was having a quiet conversation with the prosecutor, and she could see them looking through documents that hadn't been shared with the defense team. This was a clear violation of discovery rules, but Rodriguez realized that proving it would be difficult. After the break, the prosecution called a surprise witness, an intelligence analyst, who claimed to have reviewed the mission footage and radio communications. The analyst testified that Jessica's actions had been unnecessary and had actually made the situation more dangerous, but when Rodriguez cross-examined the analyst, she discovered that he had never actually seen the original footage or heard the original communications. His analysis was based on written summaries and reconstructed timelines, the same summaries that had been altered after the mission. So you're telling this court that you've formed an expert opinion about Lieutenant Martinez's actions without actually reviewing the primary evidence? Rodriguez asked. The analyst shifted uncomfortably. The original evidence was classified, above my clearance level. I worked with the information that was made available to me, Rodriguez pressed further. And who provided you with these summaries and reconstructed timelines? Colonel Webb's office prepared the materials for my analysis. The analyst admitted. This revelation sent a murmur through the courtroom. Rodriguez had just established that the expert testimony against Jessica was based entirely on information provided by the same officer, who was leading the charge against her, but the most dramatic moment came when Rodriguez called her own surprise witness. Through her investigation, she had found a communications technician who had been on duty the night of the extraction. The technician had kept unofficial backup recordings of radio communications, something that was against regulations but common practice among technical personnel. The technician, a young corporal named Danny Walsh, testified that he had heard the original radio communications from that night. According to his testimony, Jessica had repeatedly requested permission to adjust her position based on changing tactical conditions, and she had received authorization from someone higher up the chain of command. Lieutenant Martinez didn't go rogue, Walsh testified. She was following orders from someone with higher authority than Colonel Webb. I heard the authorization codes myself. This testimony contradicted everything that had been said about Jessica acting without permission. But when Rodriguez tried to introduce the backup recordings as evidence, the prosecution objected, claiming they were illegally obtained and potentially compromised. The fourth day of the trial was supposed to be the prosecution's closing arguments. Captain Rodriguez had spent the entire night preparing her final defense of Jessica Martinez, knowing that this might be her last chance to save an innocent woman's career and freedom. The courtroom was packed even tighter than before, with reporters, military personnel, and curious civilians all waiting to see how this dramatic case would end. Jessica sat in her usual spot, the metal shackles still cold against her wrists. Over the past few days, she had watched her life being torn apart piece by piece. Even though Captain Rodriguez had managed to poke holes in the prosecution's case, Jessica could see the doubt in the jury's eyes. The evidence against her looked overwhelming, and the missing pieces that might have proven her innocence were nowhere to be found. The prosecutor stood up and walked to the center of the courtroom, ready to deliver what he clearly believed would be the final blow to Jessica's defense. He had his notes organized, his voice prepared, and his arguments polished. This was supposed to be his moment of victory. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Over the past 3 days, we have heard testimony that paints a clear picture of a soldier who lost control. Lieutenant Martinez may have been a decorated service member in the past, but on the night in question, she allowed her emotions to override her training and her duty. But just as he was getting into the rhythm of his closing argument, something unexpected happened. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a loud bang that echoed through the room like a gunshot. Every head turned to see who had interrupted this crucial moment. What they saw made everyone in the room freeze in place. Admiral Rebecca Morrison, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States Navy, strode into the courtroom with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her posture military straight, and her face carried the serious expression of someone who was about to change everything. Admiral Morrison was a legend. In the Navy, known throughout the service as the Iron Lady, she had broken more barriers than any other female officer in military history. She was the first woman to command a carrier strike group, the first to head Naval Special Warfare Command, and one of the most respected strategic minds in the entire Department of Defense. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as he watched the Admiral march down the center aisle. Even the judge stood up from his bench, recognizing the incredible authority that had just entered his courtroom. Jessica's eyes widened as she saw the Admiral approaching. She had heard of Morrison, but had never met her personally. Admiral Morrison carried with her a sealed black briefcase and had 2 junior officers flanking her as she walked. Her boots clicked against the marble floor with military precision, and the sound seemed to echo in the now completely silent courtroom. When she reached the front of the room, she stopped and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, Admiral," Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "I apologize for the interruption, but I have information that is crucial to this case. Information that has only just been declassified by direct order of the Pentagon." The judge, clearly flustered by this unprecedented interruption, looked around the courtroom as if searching for guidance. "Admiral Morrison, while I certainly respect your rank and service, this court is in the middle of closing arguments. Perhaps this information could be presented through proper channels." "Your Honor," Morrison interrupted firmly, "with all due respect, this information directly relates to the charges against Lieutenant Martinez. I have documents here that were classified at the highest levels of government, and they tell a very different story than what this court has heard." The prosecutor looked panicked. He tried to object, claiming that introducing new evidence at this stage of the trial was irregular and potentially prejudicial. But Admiral Morrison's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of the courtroom. This wasn't just another witness. This was one of the most powerful people in the military, and everyone knew she wouldn't have come here unless it was absolutely necessary. The judge called for an immediate recess and requested that all counsel join him in his chambers along with Admiral Morrison. The jury was escorted out, and the spectators were left to whisper among themselves about what could possibly be so important that it would bring an admiral into a courtroom. The conference in the judge's chambers lasted almost an hour. Through the closed doors, observers could occasionally hear raised voices and what sounded like heated discussions. Captain Rodriguez emerged looking stunned, while the prosecutor appeared pale and shaken. The judge looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was completely different. Admiral Morrison took the witness stand with the bearing of someone who was about to reveal secrets that would shake the foundations of everything the court had heard. She was sworn in with the same oath as every other witness, but everyone knew that her testimony would be unlike anything they had heard before. "Admiral Morrison," the judge said, his voice respectful, but curious, "please tell the court why you felt it necessary to interrupt these proceedings." Morrison looked directly at the jury as she began to speak. "For the past 4 days, this court has been presented with a version of events that is not only incomplete but deliberately misleading. Lieutenant Martinez is not on trial for the reasons you have been told. She is here because she was the victim of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of military command. A gasp went through the courtroom. This was not what anyone had expected to hear. Morrison continued, her voice steady and authoritative. 6 months ago, Lieutenant Martinez was not just participating in a simple extraction mission. She was working as part of a highly classified counterintelligence operation designed to identify and capture a traitor within our own ranks. A traitor who had been selling sensitive information to enemy forces for over 2 years. Morrison opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder of documents. Elena Volkov was not just an intelligence asset, as this court has been told. She was a trained CIA operative working undercover to identify the source of intelligence leaks that had been compromising our operations throughout Eastern Europe. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. If Elena was a CIA operative, then everything about the mission had been misrepresented. Jessica's actions that night suddenly took on a completely different meaning. Lieutenant Martinez's mission that night was not to extract a local intelligence source, Morrison continued. She was operating under direct orders from my office to protect a valuable CIA operative whose cover had been blown by the very traitor we were trying to catch. Morrison explained that Jessica had been working under a classified chain of command that bypassed normal military channels. Her seemingly rogue actions had actually been part of a carefully planned operation designed to expose the traitor while protecting ongoing intelligence operations. Every action Lieutenant Martinez took that night was specifically authorized by my office, Morrison stated firmly. She was not acting emotionally or recklessly. She was following direct orders from the highest levels of Naval Special Warfare Command. The Admiral then revealed the most shocking part of her testimony. The traitor we were trying to catch, the person who had been selling American secrets to enemy forces, is sitting in this courtroom today. Colonel David Webb has been under investigation by military intelligence for over 8 months. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Colonel Webb, who had been sitting calmly in the witness section, suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights. His face went white and he started to stand up as if he might try to leave. Colonel Webb, Morrison continued, has been receiving payments from foreign intelligence services in exchange for information about special operations missions, troop movements, and the identities of intelligence assets. Elena Volkov's cover was blown because Colonel Webb sold her identity to enemy forces. Morrison presented evidence that had been gathered over months of investigation. Bank records showing mysterious deposits into Webb's accounts, recorded conversations between Webb and foreign contacts, and communications that proved he had been providing classified information to enemy agents. Lieutenant Martinez's actions that night saved Elena Volkov's life and protected an entire network of intelligence operations, Morrison explained. The civilian casualties that Colonel Webb attributed to her recklessness were actually the result of his own leaked intelligence, which allowed enemy forces to prepare for our extraction attempt. The prosecutor sat frozen at his table, realizing that his entire case had just collapsed. The charges against Jessica were based on false information provided by the very person they were now learning was a traitor. Admiral Morrison's final statement was directed at Jessica herself. Lieutenant Martinez maintained her cover even when faced with court-martial and potential imprisonment. She was willing to accept disgrace and destroy her own career rather than compromise an ongoing counterintelligence operation. The silence in the courtroom after Colonel Webb's arrest was deafening. Jessica Martinez sat in her chair, no longer wearing the cold metal shackles that had marked her as a criminal for the past 4 days. Her wrists still showed red marks where the metal had pressed against her skin, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she could breathe freely. Admiral Morrison remained on the witness stand, her commanding presence still filling the room. The documents she had brought were now spread across the prosecutor's table, each page revealing another piece of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life and career. Judge Harrison looked around his courtroom, clearly struggling to process everything he had just heard. In 30 years of military law, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. A decorated officer had been revealed as a traitor, while the soldier everyone thought was guilty had actually been a hero protecting national security. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Harrison said, his voice heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. "In light of Admiral Morrison's testimony and the evidence she has presented, this court has no choice but to dismiss all charges against Lieutenant Martinez immediately and with prejudice." The words hit Jessica like a physical force. After 4 days of watching her life being torn apart, after listening to people she trusted describe her as unstable and reckless, after facing the possibility of spending years in military prison, she was suddenly free. The relief was so overwhelming that she had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from falling over. Captain Rodriguez, her defense attorney who had fought so hard against impossible odds, stood up with tears in her eyes. "Your Honor, Lieutenant, Martinez has endured 4 days of character assassination based on lies and fabricated evidence. She has shown incredible courage in maintaining her silence about classified operations, even when that silence nearly cost her everything." Admiral Morrison stepped down from the witness stand and walked directly to Jessica. The entire courtroom watched as the highest-ranking female officer in the Navy approached the woman, who had been treated like a criminal just moments before. "Lieutenant Martinez," Admiral Morrison said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I want to personally apologize for what you have endured. The constraints of operational security meant that we could not reveal the truth about your mission. Until now, you maintained your cover even when faced with disgrace and imprisonment, and that level of dedication is exactly what we expect from our finest warriors." Jessica stood up slowly, still processing the dramatic reversal of her situation. "Admiral, I was just doing my job. I took an oath to protect and defend this country, and I was willing to honor that oath regardless of the personal cost." The Admiral nodded with approval. "That attitude is exactly why you were chosen for this operation. Your willingness to sacrifice your own reputation to protect ongoing intelligence operations shows the kind of character that makes someone truly exceptional." Admiral Morrison then turned to address the entire courtroom. "Let me be clear about what really happened 6 months ago in Eastern Europe. Lieutenant Martinez was operating under my direct authority as part of a counterintelligence operation that had been in planning for over a year. We had suspected for months that someone with access to classified information was selling secrets to enemy forces." She explained how the operation had been designed to flush out the traitor while protecting valuable intelligence assets. Elena Volkov's extraction had been carefully planned to create a situation where the mole would be forced to reveal himself through his actions. Colonel Webb's testimony over the past few days has been a series of lies designed to cover up his own treasonous activities, Morrison continued. Every piece of evidence that disappeared, every witness whose testimony seemed rehearsed, every missing document that might have supported Lieutenant Martinez's defense, all of it was orchestrated by Webb to protect himself. The full scope of Webb's betrayal was staggering. For over 2 years, he had been providing enemy forces with information about special operations missions, troop movements, and the identities of intelligence assets. His gambling debts had made him vulnerable to recruitment by foreign agents, and he had been receiving regular payments in exchange for classified information. Elena Volkov's cover was blown because Colonel Webb sold her identity to enemy forces, Admiral Morrison explained. The hostile reception our extraction team encountered that night was the direct result of Webb's leaked intelligence. He then used Lieutenant Martinez as a scapegoat to explain the mission's complications. Morrison revealed that the missing evidence from the trial hadn't actually disappeared. It had been deliberately hidden by Webb and his co-conspirators. The security footage, communication logs, and mission reports all existed and clearly showed that Jessica had acted with authorization and had saved lives through her quick thinking and tactical expertise. The civilian casualties that Colonel Webb attributed to Lieutenant Martinez's recklessness were actually caused by enemy forces who had been warned about our extraction attempt, Morrison said. Lieutenant Martinez's actions prevented those casualties from being much worse. The prosecutor, who had spent 4 days trying to destroy Jessica's reputation, stood up and formally apologized to the court. Your Honor, it's clear that my office was provided with false information and fabricated evidence. We were unknowingly manipulated into prosecuting an innocent woman while the real criminal sat in our courtroom as a witness. But Admiral Morrison wasn't finished. She had brought more than just exoneration for Jessica. She had brought recognition for the heroism that had been hidden behind layers of classification and operational security. Lieutenant Martinez's actions during the extraction saved not only Elena Volkov's life, but potentially dozens of other intelligence assets whose identities would have been compromised if Elena had been captured and interrogated, Morrison explained. Her quick thinking under pressure and her willingness to adapt to changing tactical conditions represent exactly the kind of leadership we need in our Special Operations Forces. Morrison reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small blue box that everyone in the courtroom immediately recognized. It contained the Navy Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor that could be awarded to a naval service member. Lieutenant Martinez, Admiral Morrison said, opening the box to reveal the medal inside. By the authority vested in me by the Chief of Naval Operations and with the approval of the Secretary of the Navy, I hereby award you the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The courtroom erupted in applause as Morrison pinned the medal to Jessica's uniform. After 4 days of being treated like a criminal, Jessica was now being honored as a hero in the same room, where she had nearly lost everything, but the Admiral had one final surprise. Lieutenant Martinez, effective immediately, you are promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Commander. You will be assigned to my personal staff at Naval Special Warfare Command, where your experience with counterintelligence operations will be invaluable in protecting our forces and our allies. Jessica was overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of her situation. Just hours earlier, she had been facing the possibility of spending years in prison. Now she was being promoted and given a position working directly for one of the most respected officers in the Navy. The media coverage of the trial's dramatic conclusion was immediate and intense. News outlets that had spent days portraying Jessica as an unstable female soldier who couldn't handle the pressure of elite military service were now scrambling to rewrite their stories. Headlines changed from questioning whether women belonged in special forces to celebrating Jessica as a hero who had risked everything to protect national security. The case became a landmark example of how the military justice system could be manipulated by those it was meant to serve. It led to significant reforms in how classified operations were overseen and protected from internal threats. New protocols were established to prevent evidence from disappearing during court proceedings, and additional safeguards were put in place to protect service members who were operating under classified orders. Jessica's story also became an inspiration for other women serving in elite military units. Her willingness to endure public humiliation and potential imprisonment rather than compromise ongoing operations showed that the highest ideals of military service had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character and dedication. 6 months later, Lieutenant Commander Jessica Martinez was working at the Pentagon, helping to design new counterintelligence protocols that would prevent future traitors from manipulating the system. She had not only survived her ordeal, but had emerged stronger and more determined than ever to serve her country. The empty courtroom where her life had nearly been destroyed now stood as a reminder that truth, even when buried under layers of deception and conspiracy, has a way of eventually coming to light. And sometimes justice really does prevail.